Hi guys, it's Keeno here. Welcome to my future music tutorial. I'm going to walk you through today a tune I've just finished called Enigma, which is going to be on my next EP, forthcoming on Med School Music. And hopefully you'll learn a bit more about the way I put my songs together and how I focus more on the music rather than the beats and the bass and the processing, but still go into a bit more detail onto deconstructing this tune and trying to explain some of the processes behind it. This track's started out as just a string quartet idea, and then kind of morphed into a drum and bass idea once I started remixing the string parts. But usually I work just in MIDI notes and using the instrument, like the VST instruments, on their own, rather than just bouncing out to audio all the time and trying to do everything in audio, because it gives me a lot more flexibility with the music itself, instead of having to go through, I don't know, like Melodyne and try and change notes that I could just use a MIDI note for. And then once I get to the pre-master stage, that's when I go and bounce out most of the string parts, or the ones that I really want to be at the forefront of the mix. I bounce those to audio so I can actually see where the peaks are in the audio, and I can understand the part from a different perspective. So throughout this tune there's really prominent strings. The introduction ones are pretty laid back, I guess, but they have that attack to them. But I really wanted to capture the grit you can get from a violin and bring that really to the forefront of the tune. So I'm just going to play up to the first drop, and then we'll probably focus in on the strings on the drop and see how I work those through. So. The tune's called Enigma, by the way. So this is just a chord sequence that I came up with on the piano initially, and then recorded the MIDI parts, playing them through the piano, and then sliced them horizontally so that each part of the chord was in a separate voice. And then I took the top part and put it in a violin, the second part put it in a cello and viola, and the third part put it in a cello, and then the bass I just put in a double bass. And then I initially had them all playing pizzicato, which sounded really cool, but I'm writing another tune that has that kind of effect in it, and it didn't really capture the mystery that I wanted to, so I actually had them playing staccato in the end. So on their own they sounded like this. So that's basically the main riff that they do throughout the introduction, but they just change octave halfway through. And then the double bass comes in. And you can hear the first violin part here is also alternating octaves in itself. So that the part just doesn't feel like it's playing the same chord, same chord, same chord, same chord, same chord, because that will get really repetitive very quickly. But they are playing essentially the same chord, but they're just swapping parts the whole time, so that the overall sound is different to the just playing the same note all the time. This is coming out of East-West. I bought this, I don't even know now, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. No, 5 or 6 years ago. And it was one of the first VST instruments I ever bought, like outright on my own with money that I'd earned from being a producer. So it's kind of become part of my sound, and the two are kind of inseparable at the moment, and I don't really know this library of sounds inside out, backwards. So if I wanted a certain effect in a song, I can, instead of having to troll through the whole library, I know exactly where to go. And it's a really, really strong core basis of my sound, so that in time I can add little extra bits on top of that, but I don't really want to just have to buy a whole new library and have to start that process all over again. So this one is actually, it's staccato round robin ×4. So every 4 notes, it's the sample is 4 notes long essentially. So every 4 notes it alternates a pattern, and you get to a natural rhythm in that way. And I think the viola part is round robin as well. I think the cello is, but only 3 times. So there again, you have an overlap of a 3 and a 4, which adds the variation of the sound. On their own, they sound really, really nice, but they sound even better and more accurate if you assemble them as a string quartet. And they sound more like a full ensemble then, really. So I think it's best if you use these East-West things as a kind of group. Solo instruments they sound a bit forced and a bit electronic if you kind of use them all the time, but as a background texture they're usually really, really cool. I really want to get this section recorded like properly live by a string quartet. It would be really, really cool. And I've actually got some ideas to get that down for my next album, which will be really cool, but we'll see what happens for that. So the only thing that's happening there is that the first chord, which is an A-flat major chord in the second inversion, if you want to know, but it's basically I take the top note and put it on the bottom note and then repeat, and then take the top note and put it on the bottom and then repeat, and then take the top note and put it on the bottom, so that if you were playing on the piano, it would just move down the piano quite naturally in your hand, and on the violin it just means that they just swap strings. So it's quite an easy way to just get from an upper octave to a lower octave without just directly cutting. So it's just a nice way of transitioning between 16 bars, so you kind of blur that dance rigid 16 bar structures that we're used to. So it's a nice little trick there. So yeah, there's the introduction staccato strings, and then as the introduction starts to build, we get these sustain strings coming in, which are a lot more full, and they are ensemble textures. There are ensemble samples as well in the same East-West software. So I'll just solo these and listen to them on their own too. So these strings on their own don't really sound that nice. Like, they don't sound too realistic because they're isolated and the samples are really, really clean and there's nothing going on around it. But added into the texture of the rest of the song, they really add warmth and dynamic to the overall sounds, and they fill your mid-range with yumminess rather than just it being empty and clean. I got the music for these sustain string parts from the introduction staccato shorter string parts, and just literally copied the MIDI notes and elongated them into legato notes so that they were all combined. And the preset that I'm using on this, in this case for East-West, is a sample that modulates using the mod wheel, so that you could go from a very low velocity note to a very high velocity note without actually having to change, like re-trigger the MIDI note, which is really handy. You can see this, hear this in action quite clearly here, as the chord builds up from really low volume. So it's using the modulation wheel. I don't actually have one on my keyboard, and I can't change that from a pitch bend to a mod wheel, which is really annoying. I've tried, but I'm actually just using the CC1 modulation in Cubase itself, and I just drew it in with a mouse because that was the easiest thing to do at the time. You could get the most difference in sound is actually in this section of the I don't know the scale of the graph, but as you get past this line, the crescendo is kind of it doesn't really go up to super loud, so you can kind of get like a crescendo from quite quiet to moderately quiet, really effective. But if you want to go super loud, you kind of have to just like slam it into a limiter until it distorts to get that like really rich quality, which is what happens at the end just before the drop. And then I built up this string texture in the same way as the introduction strings as I was copying the MIDI. So they've got violins, violas, cellos, basses, but on the bottom I've also added a quiet full string section preset. So it's I think 64 string players or something ridiculous, and it sounds really nice just on its own. And it's good to have in the background to kind of fill the gaps in between all the parts, because you can't change which instrument is playing which note in that big preset. It kind of just does it itself, and the way it does that, the way East-West does that process is quite natural anyway. So it's the easiest way of achieving that effect without actually having to go through the laborious process of scoring strings. So that's a little shortcut from me. Yeah, so as the strings get towards the drop, just about here at bar 65, they start going into isotope nectar, which has a saturation plugin on it, which essentially just warms the sound as it comes through in a way like a limiter would, but instead of it being as harsh as a limiter, it just adds a few more harmonics to the sound. I've also got a compressor using Isotope Nectar. Usually this is a vocal plugin, but I use it on everything because it's one of these really amazing all-in-one kind of plugins, which amazing for saturation, for EQ and compressing. So it's good for group buses, essentially. That's what I use it for. So if I have loads and loads of different violin parts, then I'll put one of these on, and it's a nice way of tailing out the sound and being able to tighten it up. And it's also got the saturation sound that it has. It just distorts the sound without it sounding like it's just been smashed through. I don't know, like it doesn't sound like it's just been distorted, as it were. So you can hear the difference if I do a little preview here. There's a pad left on in there, sorry. And then without. It kind of gets to a level and then it just stays there. Whereas if with the saturation on, it gets to that level and then the top end starts opening out, which kind of is a bit more appealing if you're trying to get up to a drop moment. You kind of want to fill the high end with lots of energy and then get the focus on the bass line. So that's why I did that. So those are the string parts of the introduction, all sorted basically. And the other things that are going on in the introduction are a guitar, and there's some filtered elements from the drop, which obviously were added after I'd written the introduction. And I've got a very simple sine sub underneath the orchestra to add another layer of warmth, which is only necessary for dance music, really. If this was just a track that wasn't necessarily going to be a drum and bass track, I would have left that out. And then there's also some effects, lots of rises towards the drop itself, building up the high end, as I said before. And then there's this kind of space noise that I found on freesound.org, which just kind of just sounds a bit weird, but it adds a bit of like ambience and context to the introduction. Just kind of sounds like wind. It's just basically white noise in the background, which again is filling up that mid-range before the drop, so that when the drop comes in, the bass really fills up that bottom end and you get the crispy high end from the drums, and you get that sucking, which really brings the power into the song. So yeah, the introduction's pretty simple from a structural view, but musically it's kind of just about where the musical parts overlap, and they don't how they don't just go from up here to down there to up there to here. They actually move from part to part through arpeggiated figures like I showed you. So this is the guitar part, also by East West, and it features just in the breakdown before the initial drop. It's the library it's from is called Goliath, and in here you've got things from organs to synths to brass, piano, orchestra, electric guitar, ethnic percussion, choir, acoustic guitar, just in this one library. And you can buy just this library, I think, for like $25, I think. And it can literally, I think I could probably survive. If I was just to choose one pack, I would probably just choose this one, because it's the one I'm drawn to the most, and it's the most versatile. The guitar part itself is just a relatively simple, clean lead guitar, heavily processed. The music's the same thing 3 times, but the 3rd time it happens, you just leave off the last few notes. The interesting thing about this guitar part though is that at high velocities, where's it gone? At high velocities, a different sample is triggered, which is a pitch bend. So as you can see here at bar 49, there's a velocity that looks way out of context, but actually that's just to achieve the slide effect. It adds a bit more character and makes it sound like it's being played by a musician instead of just by a computer, and that's basically what our music's all about, trying to sound like it's made by a human instead of a computer. The effects on there are relatively straightforward. There's one bypassed. Oh, that's because, it's basically just a ping pong delay, Cubase's standard own, and the settings are quite long, so there's lots of feedback and it's delaying quite a lot, so that the guitar parts, the notes, they overlap and they add to themselves and create chords and stuff, rather than it just being a straightforward melody. And it's quite a kind of hands up moment in the song as well, so you kind of want people to pay attention to the melody. On top of that, there's just a camel fat on here really, which is just a filter. It's not being used to distort the sound in any way. I'm just using it to filter because it's got a really, really harsh resonant filter on camel fat, and you can get the sound to within a very specific frequency band without having to like go through loads of stacking EQs and stuff like that, which is quite nice. Without the camel fat, the guitar kind of sounds completely different though. It's got really harsh high end on it, so I just wanted to soften that sound out and make it more in context with what's going on. It's a lot softer. And then there's just a Cubase simple compressor on there because there doesn't really need to be any fancy compression going on. I'm just flattening the sound out a little bit and just tailoring it into the mix a little bit more, so there's not so many big spikes just before the drop. Excuse me. There's also some reverb here, which I am using Valhalla room reverb, which is incredible. For in general, I tend to use as few instances of reverb as I possibly can per project, mainly because it stops me from adding too much reverb to a song. And secondly, it's actually just a lot easier on the ears if you just have one acoustic in a track, rather than trying to stack loads of different acoustics in and mash them together into a mix. It's kind of just doesn't really work like that, especially with instruments and samples that already have reverb on them and already sound like they've been recorded in a space. So I guess the only reason why I would add reverb at all to any of the samples from East West, especially the string samples, is just for an effect as opposed to a mix choice. So this is obviously, I wanted it to be sound like it's in a massive space and the melody elongates, so I've added quite a lot of reverb. It sounds completely different with the reverb on. Valhalla Room reverb is something I picked up quite recently. I think it's about a year old now. I bought it just before I finished my last album, so that would be about a year. Because I realised just as I was mixing down my last Futurist album, like all of the reverb just sounded really fake, and I was like, I need to fix this problem. How much is this plugin? Oh, €23. Okay, that's probably quite worth the investment. So I went through and remixed all of my album tunes using this reverb plugin instead of Cubase's own, except on my snare drums, oddly, because this one only goes, the only drawback of this plugin that it only goes up to 15,000 hertz, whereas the Cubase standard one goes all the way up to 20,000. And when you're remixing, when you're doing drum and bass, you really want a crisp high end on your snare drums, so that's the only exception. But yeah, this reverb plugin has one of the longest kind of tails of any plugin that I've seen as well, and it's really rich and on its own sounds great, and it's got loads of good presets as well. They've got loads of different subcategories, and each preset is very different, which is useful. So some of them can be quite inspiring as well. There's this preset called Vocal Short Slap Room, which sounds odd, but actually is like you're standing in a telephone box, and it's like really bizarre if you're on headphones, you know, listen to it. It's just kind of like how inspiring you can, how creative you can be just with a reverb plugin, and it really can change sounds and it lead you to different places in your song, which is really useful, basically. The other things that are useful, like the Valhalla is useful, is actually for bass, because it's got a really, really nice stereo image naturally, and if you just add a tiny bit into a bass sound, it can really add to the wideness and warmth to the sound. So I guess the next thing to talk about would be my bass lines. They're actually all in audio form at the moment because this is a pre-master project, and I've already bounced all of the silent presets that I'd made into audio, and but the creative process behind these silent things isn't really that important. It's just a simple Reese and some added saw waves on top, and it's not really anything that's not been done before, but the sound overall is like one that really, really fills up the speaker system. So I guess we'll find out what it's like. So that's literally just a Reese bass with some distortion on the high end, and then layered on top of that, I've got this other sound. Which is essentially the same thing, just really, really, really distorted to the point where it's starting to, you can hear it slam on the limiter. And it would be really cool to have that massively in the forefront of the tune, but it would completely drown out the rest of the elements in the song. But as a subtle background into the bass, it really makes a difference. It fills up that part of the spectrum between about 300 and 1000 hertz, which kind of just makes the song seem a lot fuller. I guess I could go back and show you how I made these bass sounds, but it would kind of be a waste of time, because I think these kind of decisions are like the ones you should be making on your own, because they're really creatively driven, and I can just only advise you on how to mix the songs down and how to kind of tailor your ideas and like improve your ideas. But the really creative input, it has to be from you, otherwise the song that you're writing will just sound like someone else, and that's kind of the crux of the problem that most producers have, I guess. But yeah, I think this sub bass is just playing the part of the pizzicato double bass right at the beginning of the song, so it's got the same notes as that double bass, and it's got the it does the same rhythm as well, but all I've done really is just really exaggerate those notes. So if it's a C, it really has to be a loud C, and if it's going to be a bottom G, it's going to have to really be a loud bottom G, just so that the music is the thing that's driving the song forwards, rather than having to rely on amazing sound design or super tight drums just to carry the song. So yeah, I think as this song goes on though, the bass line does develop, and there's added layers on top of it. But in the most part, the music is the driving force behind this tune. I'll just go quickly and show you the more sort of, I don't know how to describe, like the more layery bass sounds in the tune, I guess. So, again, this is just a simple re-space that's been distorted a lot, and all of these extra elements that you're hearing are just results of that distortion process, and they are achieved basically through trial and error. There's not really any end goal that I was trying to achieve. It was just, does it sound nice? Does it sound better if I add this, or worse than if I add this, and then just continue that process. But you can see I've actually separated the parts here between the sub, and then there's a kind of mid sound again, just as I did before in the main section of the drop, so that the sound doesn't sound like it's been massively mid-scooped, and it doesn't sound over bright or anything like that. It's just kind of in context with the rest of the strings that are going on in the song as well. There's quite a lot of processing on these sounds, but again, it's mostly just distortion that's been added. There's not really any like rhythm or deliberate choice behind it. It's just trial and error, and it'd be kind of pointless for me to direct you through that, because I can't really replicate those decision processes. But like, I guess the plugins that I use for distortion are Trash 2, which I've just got, which is incredible. Like, really impressed by Trash 2. It's made by Isotope again. They've got loads and loads of presets that you can probably waste about 3 days going through. And they've got loads of functionality just out of a distortion plugin, which I love. That's what I like most about Isotope's plugins, that they just aren't useful for, they just are useful for more than the thing that they were designed for, which I really like that. In this case, I'm using some tape saturation, and I've not really messed around with any other parts of this VST instrument. I mean, they've got filters, they've got a convolution, dynamics and delay all built into this, and like, you can kind of do everything you want in just this one plugin. But at this point in the creative process, all I wanted was some warmth and distortion in the sound, so I just added some tape saturation, and then I proceeded to add some more distortion using Native Instruments Supercharger and some Absinthe 5 effects, which is a plugin made by Native Instruments too. I just used a resonator here, which is basically just a comb filter, I think, basically. It's creating odd resonances in the sounds and just making it a bit more interesting sonically. Again, there was no real reasoning for me behind choosing this particular plugin at a particular time. It just sounded nice. So I guess just see what you can come up with using your tools and hopefully you'll get to the point where you'll get a nice full spectrum, and the bass end will be feeling like really nice and warm but not overpowering. So without any plugins at all, this is what this sounds like. So on its own, that does sound quite nice, but it's really dry, and it's essentially the same thing as the sub part. Ooh, wrong one. In fact, this version is this version high passed, so at 200 hertz. So you're literally just missing the sub out of this sound. So if you were to play them on top of each other directly as they are, they would just add on top of each other and make everything way too loud. So I went through and I wanted to add some distortion so that those two waveforms wouldn't combine to make the same, to make twice the loudness, so that they would actually just add to the overall sound of the tune. So I added some tape saturation using isotope trash 2, and that sounds like this. It's adding quite a lot of gain as well. But yeah, it's just adding quite a lot to the sort of region between 200 and 700 hertz. You can see it in a spectrum analyzer quite clearly, but it's a little more difficult to hear those kind of differences in it with your ear. So I would advise, if you were going to use tape saturation or any type of distortion, you would probably best getting a spectrum analyzer as well, just to make sure that you aren't adding loads of unnecessary like mid-range to your sound, because it will suck the volume out of your mix, and that's not really well desirable really. But yeah, Trash 2 first. The next thing I added was Supercharger, and I did it before Trash 2 because I like the way Trash 2 sounds, so I'm just trying to subtly change the sound before it goes in there, so that the effect that Trash 2 is doing is amplified more, rather than me changing that sound that I really like. So it encourages me to be a bit more sparing with any additions that I make, and also means that I don't end up ruining the sound that I have spent time getting to a point where I like. So with Supercharger off and then on, that's quite a drastic change this time. So it's I've taken loads of gain out of the sound and essentially just flattened it into a pancake. But the one thing that it's done is widen the stereo image loads, so that like this isn't the main part of the bass line, this is just intended to be an additional layer. So I didn't want it to be super loud and really present. I just wanted it to expand the stereo image and add to the warmth of the bass line, because then we'll get an overall better sound instead of just a louder sound, which doesn't always equal better. So yeah, the change in using Supercharger is quite drastic. So it's only compressing about -8 to, well, about 8 dB. So it's not that much, but I have turned the output way down. So the final thing I added was Absinthe 5. And I think, yeah, this is another stereo image kind of thing. So if you have a visualizer for stereo imaging, you'll be able to see quite clearly. I've got one up there, but like it's not really something you should rely on a spectral analysis for, because you could hear this in your headphones really clearly, or if you're in a treated room, then you could hear it quite clearly on speakers. But it's just essentially ramming the sound into a box so that it stays on the outside of the stereo image, as opposed to taking up the middle section, the core sound in your song, so that you can separate the layers of your bass sounds in the stereo image without having to work too hard to separate them in the kind of like frequency spectrum. Like, I think that's the one thing that when I'm going from creative stage to mix down stage, that's the one thing I focus on most, is the stereo image, to make sure that I can separate sounds both in the stereo image and in the kind of frequency spectrum, so that there's like a transparency in my mixes, which means that you can make the most of the music and be able to have loud drums and bass at the same time. So yeah, this Reese distortion layer here was actually showing off quite a few of the mix choices that I make in a pre-master stage of the tune, but primarily it's all towards one goal, I guess. So yeah. During the first section of the drop, while the bass is doing its thing, on top, the loudest element are these string parts. Which sound pretty cool, but they are, as this is a pre-master stage, they are bounced out to audio, but I've kept the VSTs in for this project, so you'll be able to hear the different layers. So you'll be able to hear that there's basically 4 sounds making up each 16 bar loop. So you got one sound, and then a reverse pizzicato, and then we've got another one there. So the as it drops, we've got these, they're called Bartok pizzicatos, also by East West, and on their own they sound a bit weird, but what's happening is that on a violin, they're plucking the strings so hard that it's slapping back on the fingerboard and creating a really nasty resonance on the fingerboard, which sounds a bit horrible if you're just like one violin doing it in the middle of a in the middle of a song. But if you add loads and loads of violins together to do that, they sound like they're slapping, like it just sounds really, really percussive, and it's really aggressive, and it's like just a sound that really grabbed me. I was like, well, I could do something with this. It sounds like a synth. So I took that sound and ran with it and ended up making this 16 bar loop of sounds. So it's just playing a high C and then a low C, and then we have a reversed version of that sound playing again and again, coupled with a violin trill. So it's so that's basically 2 bars and then a low, the same thing down an octave, and then it's the same thing reversed. So it's actually not made of anything but one element. It's just I've made a 4-bar loop using MIDI as if I was composing using audio. It's kind of bizarre. So even though I don't bounce out to audio until the pre-master stage, I kind of work like I'm in audio, but that's weird. So yeah, the first sound I've got here is this Bartok Conky Bass Behave, and then the second one is this Psycho, which is from that famous film, but it's actually just one of these elements again that caught my ear from the sample library that I've been waiting ages to fit into a song, and this is the one that it ended up fitting into. So I'm really pleased that it worked out that way. So I've got one up and one down, and a pizzicato that's really delayed, and that's essentially just adding, because these Bartok pizzicatos don't really have much note, like they get a bit detuned and they're not really that tight on the notes. It made my kind of mix feel a bit unsteady when it had like so many bass elements going on, so I added a subtle pizzicato just to give a bit of pureness to the note, so that it sticks out more in the mix rather than actually having to be louder. But yeah, these string parts on their own were kind of a bit plain, and they didn't really sound engaging enough to be the main element in a drop. So I added some saturation again using Isotope's Nectar, and did some compression and some EQ. But really the process was when I bounced out to audio and got to the pre-master stage, I added some distortion using Camel Fat, and then side-chained the bass line to the violin part so that they never competed for the same space. And you can hear that effect happening quite clearly when the first note of the violin's over. And it has the effect of drawing your attention first to the violin and then to the bass, and then to the violin and then to the bass. I think if I hadn't side-chained it, the whole mix would just kind of flow and be really, really like muddy, and wouldn't have much rhythm to it. So that was the main decision behind side-chaining those two parts together. Ordinary, I probably wouldn't do that because it would ruin the flow of a song. But in this tune, it actually made a lot of difference to the vibe and the rhythm. So it actually helped quite a lot. So those two parts really are playing in dialogue at this point, and I wanted to really make the most of that with the drum kit, but it proved really, really difficult. I went through 14 or 15 different drum kits before I settled on this one, and loads of different types of drum patterns and variations here and there, but in the end I settled for something pretty straightforward with a really steady kick drum, because although these drop string parts and the bass parts are really rhythmic and they really lead you through the song, there's not actually a strict beat that you can catch into just listening to those soloed. So there needed to be something that held the rhythm of the song together and enable people to just dance to it. So the drums on their own sound like this. So they repeat quite regularly, but because there's so much else going on in the song, the drums don't really get boring. And usually I would vary the drum rhythm quite a lot and add a lot of extra sort of hits at the end of the 16-bar loops, for example, or even 8 bars. But in this song, it was kind of important to keep that steady rhythm the whole way through the song so people can actually get into the groove and not be distracted by loads of like effects that kind of are unnecessary. So if you were to just listen to the strings and the drums, you can really see how much easier it is to get into that groove. And then the bass part added into that. So you can really see how those three parts fit together, and you can actually see how simple this song is in reality. There's only drums, bass and string elements on the drop. There's no sort of loads of synth like sound design effects going on. There's not really any like automation going on. There's not any filtering going on. It's basically just the string parts, the bass, distortion on the bass, and then a clean drum break. The drums themselves, though, I did take, as I said, quite a long time to decide, and there are lots of layers for me. This is quite a lot for me, but in the end, the processing on drums for me is always the same process, and that process is bussing all of the kicks together, all of the snares together, and everything else that's not a kick or a snare together, and then everything goes through a drum bus too. And at each stage, there's a camel fat that adds like 1 or 2% distortion, and that essentially adds loudness without gain because it's acting as a limiter. But camel fat is one of the plugins where somehow it managed to achieve quite a lot of extra loudness without ruining the transients completely. So I kind of just use camel fat quite sparingly, and then if the transients are suffering a little bit, I would tend to use Native Instruments Transient Master, but again, sparingly, 11% on a kick drum and maybe 15% on a snare drum. It's just that these days drum breaks can be so heavy and like dominating in a tune, and like I know it's drum and bass, but like you don't have to have super piercing snare drums in a song for people to dance to. And I think it's more important, especially for my music, that the drums stay natural and that they provide the rhythmic energy required to make the tune a drum and bass tune, but they don't dominate the music. Again, like the bass parts, I don't want them to dominate the music. I just want the song to be taken forwards by the sort of the music itself, rather than having to rely on all these production tricks. So I'm just going to walk you through now the buses for my drum kit. The first one I'm going to show you through is the percussion. There's basically not much going on here. The loops I'm using are from various sample packs like June Miller or Blockhead or something like that. They're all kind of basic samples, but the processing on these samples is minimal. But I really just wanted to feel the high end with loads of like fizzy goodness and loads of energy. So there's some excitation on there using camel fat, and there's a little bit of mechanical distortion. 1% on the tube. I'm going mental there, but it's kind of with hi-hats, I guess you don't really want to just slam through a distortion plugin because you'll lose all the clarity and you won't be able to hear the difference between the hits. So without the plugin though, you will hear the difference. So I just play them without camel fat and play them with camel fat. The excitation is the thing that's making the most difference here, and the gain as well. And you can also hear that it's getting rid of a little bit of the low end using the high pass filter here, the bandpass filter. But I've added just a tiny bit of resonance at around 125 hertz because there's a loop in there that has the sort of, I can't remember if I try and find it. Not that one, that one. It's got a tiny little half a kick drum in it, which doesn't sound like it's going to make much difference, but actually it layers up with the other kick drums quite nicely and adds a bit of variation to the kick drum. So without that loop, it's kind of a bit predictable. So So yeah, that's the reason why there's resonance on that. Usually it would just be a clean high pass, otherwise the percussion elements will get in the way of the kick drum and the snare drum. But yeah, that was just a quick point there. I'll move on to the snare drum now. So how many layers are there here? There's almost 11. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 layers in the end. So that's quite a lot for my snare drums, really. I don't really tend to add too many layers. Maybe 5 is probably a decent average. In the end, if you just add hits on hits on hits on hits on hits, you just end up adding gain, and you just lose the transient that you loved from the first sample that you picked anyway. So a technique that I use is basically to keep a version of the sample that you are basing your drum kit on. So if you've found a loop that you love, or just a snare drum that you love, just keep a version of that at the bottom of your project, out of the way, that you can refer to at any point, that doesn't have any processing on it, so that if you, once you have gone on a 3-hour snare drum rampage and you've added 99% on the transient master, you can go back to that sample and be like, oh yeah, that's what it sounded like. So I guess the initial snare drum that drew me to these, to build up on these snare drums rather, sorry, these 2 loops. So I didn't really want to change too much, but because of what else is going on in the song, I really needed that like 200 or 300 hertz, like hit, really punch in the stomach feeling from the snare drum. So I added that using one of these snare drums, which is the only extra addition to those 2 snare drums. But you can still hear them nice and clearly. It's just literally adding a pitch to the snare, I guess, so that it stands out in the mix a bit more clearly. All the other additions to the sound are just to fill out the snare drum and to bring it into a more cohesive kind of, like it was actually a snare drum that you could place on your desk, rather than it being made up of 9 different hits. So when I was trolling through my sample libraries and trying to find samples that fit, I was consciously thinking, okay, I need a snare drum that doesn't have too much of an initial transient, and one that has a nice long tail, for example. That's the one I was looking for, and I found, I think, this clap sample that had a nice long tail. And then I wanted to find one that had a really nice transient to it, so I went and found a rim shot that had a nice transient. So I'm not just dragging random snare drums in, and I'm not just stacking random hits on top of each other and hoping it sounds nice. I'm actually looking through my library and thinking, okay, I need to add a little bit more to this sound. I don't really want to achieve that by transient shaping or by compression or by EQ, because it will ruin my initial snare drum that I like. So I just want to find a small hit or a small addition that I can lay on top of it that will achieve that effect for me. So if I just build up this snare drum one hit at a time, you'll hear how it's been put together. So this is in chronological order as well. So this is the layers that I've added. So you can see there that I wanted a bit more to the sound, but wasn't quite sure what I wanted, so I just added like an acoustic snare drum. So this is an acoustic snare drum. And then the snare drum starts taking shape. So at this point the transient was lacking for me, so I added one with a 2 transient snare drums. And then that long tail, fizzy high end, and then I think these 2 are quite simple as well. Oops. yeah, really filling out the sound there. So processing on this snare drum, some transient shaper, some EQ from Nectar. I didn't use the Cubase standard one because this one is a little more accurate on the high passes than Cubase's standard ones. So otherwise I just probably would have used the Cubase standard one there. And then we've got Valhalla reverb, which is only on 1%, and that's basically just a stereo image thing. I think the stereo image of the snare drum was a little too like narrow beforehand. Let's check. One of those invisible changes that I like, apparently. And the final thing on the channel is this camel fat, which is adding some distortion to the sound and some excitation. Really, that's just slamming all the snare drums into a limiter and hoping it sounds nice. But it's really, I've used camel fat on every single snare drum in every single project since probably 2013. So I know exactly how much I need to use. I guess if you were, and how much I can get away with using, I guess, as well, is another thing. But as a starting point for a snare drum, I guess I would probably add about 5% mechanical distortion, 5% tube distortion, and 5% excitation distortion, and see how much difference that makes. And if it's made way too much difference, then back off on each one. And if it's not enough, then you probably need different sounds. So yeah, that's my general rule. The kick drum again is exactly the same process as the snare drum, except there's no reverb on it. That's the only difference. And you'll just hear how these samples build up. That's just a transient. That's the main body of the kick. So this was the initial loop that I liked. You can still hear that in the whole drum kit. So yeah, I think it did take me a while to get to the point where I was happy with that drum kit, but I think it was the act of going back and looking at the loop and being like, okay, actually, what does this sound like? How can I make this better? That actually made the difference for the song. So I've walked you through the drum kit, the bass, the strings on the drop. I've done the introduction strings, the sustain strings, and the guitar. So I've actually walked you through the core elements of the song. And the only changes that happen from that point onwards are either musical actual MIDI note changes, or they are reordering of sounds that have already been produced. And the only exception to that is the outro and the breakdown. So we'll look at those two sections now. The first is this piano, which is also East-West. Sometimes I use a different piano which is made by 8dio called 1969 Steinway Grand Legacy piano, which sounds like ridiculously amazing if you on headphones, and it's so realistic and it sounds beautiful, but its lower velocities just weren't quite subtle enough for this song, so I opted to use East-West's piano. And it sounds really rich, especially down on the lower ends. And I took the riff from the introduction strings, which is over here, this one, and literally just copied it back into the piano, which I had the original idea from on anyway. So yeah, you can. I actually played that into Cubase and recorded that myself rather than just typing it in using MIDI, because although it's quantized a little bit, it's not completely rigidly in eighth notes or whatever. It has to be a little bit quantized because it is a piece of dance music. You need to be able to beat match, but the piano itself isn't completely rigid and it's got mistakes in it, and I kind of like the fact that you can tell that it's been played by me rather than again by a piano, like VST instrument or whatever, and it really makes for an effective breakdown. So what I'll do is I'll play from the drop until the breakdown, and you'll hear how everything fits together, what I've shown you previously, and then I'll go into how I built up the breakdown. So at that point I could have just gone back to the introduction strings, but it made more sense for me to do something different and to lead the song somewhere else. So I went back to where the song originally started and was like, okay, I'll put this back in the piano and see what I can come up with. You'll notice that the section just before that, the guitar part comes back again, and so do the sustained strings. Well, the reasoning behind that was just to drive the song into the breakdown and transition from like the really bassy part of the song to the more musical part without actually just cutting directly from one to the other, because that would ruin the energy that you built up when people listen to it, and on the dance floor it would just stop people dancing immediately. Whereas if you kind of keep the momentum going without necessarily keeping the beats going, then they might still keep their groove going, and that was the kind of reasoning behind that. The breakdown itself is essentially the same musically as the first breakdown just before the first drop, except that there's more piano going on than strings, and the build up just with the drum kit is slightly different as well, but in general it's kind of like a repeat, as it were. But then I just want people to be focusing on this piano part. It's quite haunting. I mean, it's like you're playing this out in a club. Like, it's not really it's a bit of a different sound that you don't really hear that in a drum and bass line. So. So you can hear there that on the second drop, what I've done is taken ideas that happened consecutively on the first time when they came round, and I've just stacked them on top of each other. And you would think that that would actually, in most cases, add up to something that didn't really sound very nice, which would sound like there's too much going on. But because of the way I've built this song in particular, it actually works really well because of the way that the strings and the bass are in constant dialogue. I can actually add more on the drum, more on the bass, and more on the strings without actually the song sounding too busy. So the psycho style violin parts that happened 16 bars after the first drop now come on the drop itself, which help to like add to the forward momentum of the song because things start happening sooner and you expect something else to happen. And the distorted bass parts that I led you through earlier are also present in the set on the second drop, so there's like a lot more energy for the second drop than there was the first time. And although I rarely play the second drop out in a club because there's like something else that I need to play or whatever, like if you're listening to it on headphones, it really like stops you from switching off halfway through the breakdown to listen to another tune because like you know that there's something different coming. And that's something that I try and do with all my tunes, especially like the more dancey ones, is to try and keep it as varied as I can the second time round so that A, DJs want to play it and B, people will listen to it. So I guess that was like the reasoning behind just changing the structure slightly. But yeah, the string parts, you can hear them filtering in just before the drop as well, to build up tension. And then there's a kick roll, like just a basic. And I've also completely missed out the first beat of the drums on the second drop, so there's absolutely no drums. So you can really, that psycho violin part really tears through the mix, because once this is being mastered, like all the dynamics are rammed up to the ceiling and it sounds really, really nice and loud, that violin part will completely dominate the mix just for that one beat. And then the snare drum will come in again and it will be, that effect will just be amplified a bit more. And without that kick drum, it kind of stumbles over itself on the drop as well, which is quite a nice effect. So I'll just play the drums and the strings and you'll hear how that works out. But yeah, the song kind of develops for 32 bars in the same way that it did last time. The psycho rips on the violins happen, and then the 16 bars later, this weird vibrato-y synth comes back. This synth is kind of like it's kind of a really, really high-pitched Reese, I guess. Kind of sounds like I don't really know, like a keyboard synth or something. It's just a bit of a weird noise, but it's essentially just like saw waves and square waves combined to make a really vibrato-y synth. The pitch is modulating a lot and the cutoff is triggered to an envelope so that the sound starts with a high cutoff point and then goes down to a low cutoff point as the envelope, as time goes on, obviously. And there's loads of delay on there and there's some distortion too. Nectar adding saturation, EQ and reverb. Tiny bit of reverb. And some more tape saturation from Isotope Trash too as well. But there's no reverb on that sound from the master reverb setting that I put on the song, because it would make the tail of that synth really, really muddy and long, and it will kind of just be a bit pointless. I want it quite a narrow piercing sound in the mix, so I kept it quite dry. The drums just switch out for 4 bars there to an arm end loop that's basically completely unprocessed. I think the only thing that's going on there is a stutter using Effectrix by Sugar Bytes. It's essentially a gate, a trance gate, and you can change the pan of each gate instance, as it were, and you can change how long the gate is and how fast it happens and the mix and stuff. And it's a really useful little plugin, this one, but in this instance it's not really doing too much to the sound apart from making it more choppy. So without Effectrix it sounds like this. So there's a lot extra notes added in, so I just kept it a lot cleaner, because if without that trance gate, all the hits would just roll into each other and the bass would just swallow that sound up. So I wanted the focus to be more on the snare drum more than the shuffled hits. So yeah, a little trance gate is a good way to clean up a drum break. I think that's all on that section, but the purpose of this section really isn't to his 16 bar section isn't to it's more to build towards the end of this 16 bar section, as it were. It's building up again after the second drop, and transitions into the outro of the tune, so I'll just play it from here. So the idea there was to build up the texture as much as I possibly could, and then strip the song back to as few elements as I possibly can. So here there's only a straight sub bass, which has been distorted. Sounds wicked. I love distorted sine waves. That little popping, I think, is caused by the subchain, the side chain. When you bounce out audio, sometimes you get little clips and pops when you're side chaining quite heavily in Cubase. They're not audio they're not audible when you put them in the context of a mix, but in stems they're kind of like a bit distracting. I kind of advise you to not really worry about it too much, because you can't really hear it unless the only thing that's going on in your song is a sub and some bass. Some sub and some drums. But yeah, those little clips are kind of annoying, but I'll get over it. So yeah, the only things that are going on here are this sub bass, these strings, so those strings are playing the same notes as throughout the song, but they are played by just a simple pizzicato string instead of this aggressive sound, and it kind of has the effect of, it's kind of like a low pass filter on a violin, I guess. Like the difference is when bar top pizzicatos, they're slapping it against the fingerboard and they're creating loads of high frequency noises, whereas this is a really soft pizzicato sound, and you can just hear the the core frequency for the note. And then there's that violin trill in there as well, just to give a bit more momentum towards the end of each 4-bar phrase. It's just a little detail that's helps the song move forward. And then the drums as well, I just stripped them back a little bit. So there was these many percussion parts, and I've taken a few shaker elements out, and I've taken some white noise fills out as well. In the whole song there's just like white noise going on in the top end. It's not as loud as that because it's sidechained to the kick drum as well, but it kind of just comes in every so often, helping the song move forwards. But I take that out for the outro and just basically have some fast shakers and some slow hi-hats, and it helps to like spread the break out a bit so that the focus is more on the kicks and the snares. Yeah, that's that section. So yeah, the outro now is just taking the song to the end and fading out to silence without it just being the end of a 16-bar loop and being, okay, that's the end of the song now. I kind of didn't really feel like that was fitting for this tune in particular, so I passed some of the MIDI parts between different instruments. So I took the guitar MIDI from before and put it in the piano. So these two parts are basically just swapped job. The guitar's now the background and the piano's in the foreground, whereas before it was kind of the other way around. These little bits of audio here are literally just a bounced audio version of the VST and then reversed. So just adds a bit of texture to the sound. And there's some string parts going on underneath that. So I'll just play how the tune ends, and then I'll kind of walk you through the process of paring down each element until the end of the tune. So I'll go from here. Cool. So that's how that tune ends. The things that are going on in the drums are, if I just solo these and play that transition. So there's essentially just a crossfade between the two breaks. So there's the main drum kit that I built up for the whole tune that just high passes out and kind of I've add some delay to the sounds so that the hits start repeating on themselves, and the groove starts to break down, and then I just bring in this highly filtered and delayed break again as before and just filter it all the way down to the bottom. Sounds quite cool on its own. And then the bass is continuing on from what it was doing before, except this time it's just sustained. It doesn't have any of those gaps in. And it's just hovering, and it's actually, I think it's just mirroring the chords of the tune rather than actually playing the melody of the bass line that I put in beforehand. It's just going down the arpeggiated figure. It's just going like C and then going all the way down to the lowest C to end of the tune. And these elements all fit together like quite simply. So there's just these drop strings and bass that are being filtered down as well. There's no filtering going on, excuse me. Apart from that drum break. So the song just comes to a kind of natural end. I didn't really need to put like a kick drum at the end and be like, this is the end of the song. I didn't really need the drums to continue up to that point either, because they kind of weren't really adding anything to the tune. I could have continued the drums, that extra 16 bars, but at that point, any DJ playing it probably would have really mixed out the tune, and it wasn't really helping the outro build down to silence. It kind of kept things going too quickly, too long, and then it stopped too quickly. So the song didn't really end as nicely and as satisfyingly as it could have done. So yeah, the end of the tune just has this simple white noise effect come back, so that the song starts as it finished, have that same context to it, so it sounds like it's being performed again somewhere. I don't know, it could be anywhere, but it's one of those things that grabs your imagination and helps relate the song to something else that the person has been thinking about that day or whatever. I think it's kind of important to remember that, like, the people that are listening to your music have listened to music for a number of different reasons, and it might not just be suitable to have the tune smash it on a dance floor, and then they might not listen to it at home anymore because it's just like it's for that one purpose. Whereas I'm trying to make a tune here that's suitable for just more than one occasions, that people can go listen to it in varying different, I don't know, they can go listen to it in a club, they can go listen to it on their bus journey to work, and it would mean something else in that circumstance than it would do in another circumstance. So the song's kind of a bit more versatile in that way. And those random noises that the beginnings and ends of songs are a very good way, an effective way of doing that, because they give the listener's ear something else to associate with and to give the song context. These effects that run through the entire tune are there's not many of them. There's a couple of reverses, some rises, and I think a reverse cymbal. I'll just solo these rises for you now so you can hear what's going on, but I tend not to rely on rises and effects too much to give the song direction, and try and make sure that the music is doing that on its own, so that these effects are kind of just like DJ cues, as it were, so that the DJ knows that this is where the 16 bars ends, and he doesn't really have to worry about keeping count the entire time. And it also is another extra clue to the listener's ears where the structures, like the hidden structures in the tune are, so they can kind of understand it a bit better. So yeah, I think the effects, if I automated something there. Yeah, so basically these effects all cut out for because they're all being sent to this same reverb space as I mentioned right at the beginning, and that reverb completely mutes for the drop both times, and I didn't really want that massive load of high end to be hanging over the drop, because it would completely obliterate the strings that are going on. So I kept the effects kind of minimal on that like moment of the drop, and then brought them back in just after. And then the final little extra detail that's going on the drops of these tunes is this weird hi-hat noise, which doesn't really sound like it's doing anything at all. In fact, it's really, really random. But actually, if you listen to it in context with the bass, you'll see why I added it. So I'll play without. So this noise is super high frequency, like 10,000 to 20,000 hertz, and it's really, really quiet in the mix, but it's still audible because there's not much else going on in the song in that really high frequency band that's so like specific. So it really does like poke out the mix really, really quite loudly. But the reason why I added it there, because it sounds like, I don't know if you've ever broken a speaker before, but if you've played a speaker really, really, really loudly, and it kind of has this like flip on the end where the speaker kind of sounds like it's working too hard, and it sounds like someone's like blowing on a piece of grass or something, and that sound really achieves that on that low note there. Without it, it kind of doesn't quite fizzle enough. Really brings out that high end on that low bass note and makes it sound like the bass is massively overdriving and breaking the speaker even when it isn't. So it was just what kind of like that, one of the last additions to the tune, where I was just like, I think I could probably clean up the high end a little bit more by adding something, but it just took me a little while to find that sound, and it ended up being a hi-hat that was just sitting somewhere on a sample drive. It was just one of those final additions that made the tune really, really like feel finished to me anyway. I only finished this tune a few days ago, in fact, 2 days ago. And although I'm really, really pleased with how the song has like come together, and how each element takes the lead at one point in the song and gives it to something else in another part of the song. It's not just like, oh, there's a violin part in this tune that's really, really grabs my attention. It's like there's loads of violin parts that grab your attention at different parts of the song, and the bass does different things and the drums does different things. I guess like the only thing that I was constantly thinking about the whole way through this song was to make sure that I don't sacrifice the music at any point for the drum and bass in the tune. So the drum and bass came second, and it was like less important to me than making sure that these string parts really, and the this piano part and these string parts and these string parts really were the things that you remember from the song, and that people don't go, oh, I remember that tune, it's got sick drums, or it's got sick bass. Like, this song has drums that are good enough and bass that are good enough, but I really want people to remember the violin parts, because that's what makes my music unique, and I didn't want to drown those out in any way by adding too much effect, like too many effects, or too much processing to the sound. So like, in general, my songs are pretty simple. There's not much added processing. If it is, it's likely a little bit of distortion, or a little bit of EQ, or a little bit of reverb, like treatment, as it were. But in general, it's actually just choosing the right sound that's more important to me, and making sure that that fits in the song on its own without actually having to do too much to it. Like in the future, I guess I'm probably going to get to the point where I've done this process as much as I possibly can, and I'll have to start experimenting with sound design and making drums in synths. Like, I think, so I know that Noisia do that. Like, that's crazy. How do you do that? But like, at the moment, this is kind of the level I'm at, and the level that I find enjoyment in making music is this, and it is making most of the music in the song. So yeah, I guess this is Enigma, and yeah, hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, guys. I've been Keeno, and you've been watching my future music tutorial on my tune Enigma, which will be out on my EP forthcoming on Med School, which I think is due out in April, but we'll see, because I have yet to finish pre-masters, because I'm still undecided on one of the snare drums in one of my tunes, which is classic me. But yeah, thanks for joining me, and please check out my music on Facebook /KeenoDnB, SoundCloud /Will Keeno, and on Twitter /KeenoDnB as well. So see you soon, guys. Thanks.